Alright, so in this video I wanted to, by the way, I think I marked this up years ago and it's just terrible, I know. I cannot, I am terrible at writing and I'm terrible at staying within the lines. But it's still legible, so we'll read it. I wanted to go today, since tomorrow is Good Friday, but I'm not going to be able to do a video tomorrow. So I'm doing it on, this time we're going to go into the evidence for Jesus's crucifixion. And I just wanted to bring up this book, Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth, Bart Ehrman. I've read a lot of Bart Ehrman's books. I've seen a lot of his debates too. I think he's flipped between saying he's agnostic to atheist to agnostic to atheist. I don't know, I don't think he can ever make up his mind on what label he wants to use for himself, but I think right now it's atheist, I want to say, right? But I actually haven't read his stuff in a couple of years now, so it could have changed now. I think when he read this, he said he was agnostic, though. But yeah, he's a very vocal, the reason I bring him up is he's very vocal about disputing with the church and traditional/conservative Christians. Really seems to have a bone to pick with that stuff. And a lot of his debates are with, Christian apologetics of the conservative background. But the point I'm making is that even he admits many things that are true about the historical Jesus and about the historical church, the historical canon of the Bible. What's really interesting is his most famous works, Misquoting Jesus. I think it has some really sensational title with I forgot the subtitle, but it was also I think it was how the scribes, invented words to Jesus or something like that, where he goes into the textual criticism of the ancient manuscripts and the scribes who copied manuscripts. And I just remember in that book that he started the whole copy of copies of copies. How can we really know what the original said? And what I always find interesting is in that very book, when you read it, he will have little side notes where he admits, it's a very small amount, and actually the vast majority of what's in the current manuscripts for the Bible are completely accurate. And when you read, when we read this book, for instance, and when you read all of his scholarly books addressed to scholars and his peer-reviewed articles addressed to other fellow peer scholars on historical issues, that stuff never comes up with Bart Ehrman. You read his book on the historical Jesus, he just takes it as fact that yes, the words in the Gospels are trustworthy in the sense that these are what the original said. Because you would say if we can't know what the originals actually said, then the whole argument on whether on the claims in the Bible is moot. There's no point going elsewhere, right? Trying to claim there's evidence for the claims of the Bible. Well, if you claim that that what we have in the Bible is not even what the original said, well, the debate ends there, right? Why bother with anything else? And also, once more, why would you? It's one thing to say that and then say, well, to make my argument even stronger by saying even if it's the original, we still can't trust it for X, Y, Z. But Ehrman doesn't do that. In his books, he just takes it as a fact because he believes we actually can know a lot of things still, and he says that repeatedly in this book. Anyway, let's read this for a bit. In 1999, under the nom de plume Ajarya S., D.M. Murdoch published The Breathless Conspirator's Dream, The Christ Conspiracy, the greatest story ever sold. This book was meant to set the record straight by showing that Christianity is rooted in a myth about the Sun God, Jesus, S-U-N God, who was invented by a group of Jews in the 2nd century CE. Mythicists of this ilk should not be surprised that their views are not taken seriously by real scholars, that their books are not reviewed in scholarly journals, mentioned by experts in the field, or even read by them. The book is filled with so many factual errors and outlandish assertions that it is hard to believe that the author is serious. If she is serious, it is hard to believe that she has ever encountered anything resembling historical scholarship. Her, quote, research appears to have involved reading a number of non-scholarly books that say the same thing she is about to say, and then quoting them. One looks in vain for the citation of a primary ancient source, and quotations from real experts, Elaine Pagels chiefly, are ripped from their context and misconstrued. Still, in opposition to scholars who take alternative positions, such as that Jesus existed, she calls them, quote, historicizers. Ajaria states, quote, if we assume that the historicizers' disregard of these scholars, that is, the mythicists, is deliberate, we can only conclude that it is because the mythicist arguments have been too intelligent and knife-like to do away with. One cannot help wondering if this is all a spoof done in good humor. I love Bart Ehrman, by the way. He's a great writer. I like reading his stuff, too. He's a great debater. I don't agree with him. And a lot of the people he's debated, I also thought were great debaters, too. That I think I remember one where I actually thought he won, but in most cases, I really thought the Christian apologist won. But, of course, I'm biased. Anyway, you know, and how's about the crucifixion? Well, if you know Ajaria S., she was basically the sole source behind that old it was called the Zeitgeist documentary. It actually was in theaters back in early 2000s, I believe. Back when I was in high school, or maybe late 2000s, actually, now that I think about it. And, you know, the synopsis is basically that Jesus is entirely a myth, that he was made up based off Roman/Greek mystery cult/mythologies that believed in gods like Attis and Horus, like the Egyptian god Horus. And the whole claim is that they're all born on December 25th. She always focused on that. That's why I found interesting. Christmas. They're all born on December 25th. And also a slew of other things. Like she'd claimed they had 12 apostles. I remember for Horus, she said that he had prophets that foretold his coming that was called Anup the Baptizer. You know, obviously, like St. John the Baptist was ripped from that, and that he did miracles, and also that they bodily resurrected. Now, what's interesting is all of that is completely made up. I mean, all of it. Like Ehrman's right. I read her work too. Like, she never cites a primary source, but they're most sources sometimes they will, but it's never a primary source that says explicitly what they're saying. It's always like the primary sources that the scholars actually use for more general claims, like some other skeptical scholar trying to generally claim that the Gospels overall are borrowing like themes from Homer's Iliad because there's like similar kind of writing and stories going on. And actually, by the way, I actually find that persuasive, but I don't think it doesn't trouble me as a Christian because we know that Greek culture had penetrated the Judean landscape by this time. Like Greek culture, Hellenistic culture was everywhere in first century Judea. So first century Jews were well aware of a lot of these stories. And you have to realize the Gospels, not only were these Jewish writers aware of them, but they were also trying to reach Gentiles in their case, right? So it actually makes total sense why they might, in some instances, may even deliberately, you know, fashion their story around Homer's. That doesn't mean they made up their facts. It just means that they were trying to make it write their narrative and present the facts appearing like that. You know what I mean? Like, I've never actually think that's an issue. Like, that's a whole other argument as usual. That's my dispute with those scholars who try to use that to claim that therefore it's wrong. And I'm like, that's a total nonsense. That is a non sequitur. That does not follow. It doesn't follow that because they design some, and they never say it's all of it either. They just say they can see some themes and some parts of the Gospels that could have been adapted from Homer's Iliad. Like, okay, and that doesn't prove anything in those stories themselves was made up. And many of the Greeks actually, I mean, I don't believe Homer's Iliad, but many of the Greeks in that time actually believed Homer's Iliad was real. Not all of them. I'm not saying all of them did, but many of them actually did. And you could say that the Jews could have brought that in, where they're writing this story under the impression that the people they were, in the stories they were using to fashion theirs for, to reach other people, those people believe they're real anyway. They believe some of this stuff actually happened anyway. So anyway, that's a whole other argument. My point is that any primary source like Homer's Iliad is quoted by Ajaria S. back then as general things. She'll say, and she'll even say general arguments like, therefore we can see a pagan connection within the Gospels. But then immediately she'll say, oh, and by the way, Jesus was born on, or this God was born on December 25th and had 12 disciples and had Anup the Baptizer prophesying their existence and or their coming. And then there's no citation other than another secondary, you could say, scholar, not really a scholar, who's just an author like her saying the same thing. And that's what Ehrman's point is. It's like, this is all you people are doing. And it's true, the vast majority of scholars believe Jesus existed. But the reason I also bring this up is because the vast majority of scholars also believe certain facts about Jesus. One of them is, and this is what gets us to the crucifixion. And why is that? Because the crucifixion of Jesus is attested in literally every single source we possibly have on him. Like all four Gospels, like if we want to go through the Bible, because the Bible was still written in separate sources in its time, so all four Gospels, Acts, all of Paul's letters, even even for the people who aren't fans of Paul, all of the non-Paul letters, Revelations. You want to go outside. Now we want to go to Christian sources outside the Bible. Every single church father, going to the earliest possible, including first century ones like Clement of Rome. All the second century ones still using their own traditions, as many of them in that time claim that they were using oral traditions passed down from the apostles themselves. And in some cases, they actually were like directly connected to the apostles in some way. Like Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, and Polycarp, who we actually have one of his writings from too. And according to everybody who knew him, he was a student of the apostle John. And by the way, that alone to me is evidence enough that Jesus absolutely existed. Because when it comes to traditions, you can say that certain details get changed over time, but to say that like the core person behind everything was just entirely fabricated is just absurd. You'd have to have a massive conspiracy reason for that, and the only way a massive conspiracy works is, one, you need actual evidence for it, which they don't have any of that. But then two, you need actual like motive, opportunity, which the early Christians definitely did not have that. They were in the minority then, and they were being persecuted and hunted down and killed and tortured and thrown into the Colosseum. Like they had no reason to do any of that and make something like that up and then die for it. Every single one of them did. Like many of those non-biblical writers have their own martyrdom accounts later on, because that was just a common thing going on then. So yeah, many, many reasons to doubt the claim that Jesus didn't exist. But there's actually a very vocal minority of even a couple scholars. I think, what's his name? Robert, I forgot his last name. But I know that I read, he doesn't believe Jesus existed. He's like one of the handful that you can name out of thousands across different nations, countries, journals that you can find that actually says that. But yeah, going hand in, my also point is like that Jesus' crucifixion basically goes hand in hand with his very existence, because every single source about Jesus that supports his existence, at least, also supports his crucifixion. So he went into every single biblical source, every single church father source, every single apocryphal source that's still kind of orthodox, like the testimony of the 12 apostles written in the early 2nd century. That's like part of the Apocrypha. That, of course, is the whole focus is the crucifixion. Now we even go into the total non-Christians, like Josephus, 1st century Jewish historian, Tacitus, 2nd century Roman historian, Suetonius, another Roman historian who in passing mentions Jesus' crucifixion and never doubts it, Celsus, the Greek philosopher who was a fierce critic of Christians, using Jewish traditions, who were also fierce critics of Christians, doesn't doubt the crucifixion. Also, why is that? Because the crucifixion was considered a mockery, especially in that time. The idea that the Messiah would be crucified, which is yet another reason to believe it happened. On top of all the evidence, then you just have to think logically about that evidence. Why would anyone in like first century Jews also make such a thing up? It didn't fit any paradigm in that time. In fact, like Muslims today, this is I believe that when I read the Quran, this is actually in the Quran itself too. The idea that Jesus did not die on the cross, that he actually became in his glorified form and then smote his enemies and walked away from the cross unharmed. Muslims believe that. And any of you following like The Chosen, for instance, I noticed they're actually portraying Judas as having that belief. And, now I actually think it's very likely he actually did have some belief like that because it actually fits. It explains in the Gospels why Judas is regretful when he sees that Jesus is condemned after he betrays him, clearly implying Judas actually betrayed Jesus, thinking he was doing some good and that something else was supposed to transpire than what actually happened. And what other explanation could that be for a devotee follower of Jesus who was, believed in, or supposedly, I don't think he actually did in the end, but supposedly believed he was the Messiah, the true Messiah, all this, and then he sees something like that happen and he can't wrap his brain around it, so then he concludes he made a horrible error, and that's when he says he condemned an innocent man and he goes and hangs himself. It actually is one theory that just explains everything that we know. The little we do know about Judas is very much explained in that theory, which is why I actually believe the Chosen series is even onto something that probably, not that all the dialogue they come up with necessarily happened, but that general idea of why Judas did what he did actually, I think, is what probably transpired. And Muslims today believe that. But you know what's ironic? They're actually further evidence, again, that Jesus, the historical Jesus, was crucified, because even the Quran admits that they attempted to crucify him and they put him on the cross. But then right when they're about to do that, he's just like, nope. I'm the Messiah. I'm God's chosen. You can't touch me. I'm out of here. Which another reason is why I'm not Muslim, because that story just to me just reeks of re-editing the original story to conform to what you want it to be, is what it looks like to me. But yeah, that's every single possible source goes into Jesus' crucifixion. You can't find one that doesn't. And another source. So people, Bart Ehrman brought up Elaine Pagels here. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Maybe Elaine Pagels. I think it's Elaine Pagels, but I've read her works too, what he just referred to. Because she's a scholar, she is a real scholar, and she goes in deep about Gnosticism in the early church. She's not a Christian, she's a fierce critic of the traditional church today. And she's one of these very scholars that loves studying Gnosticism because she loves trying to argue in many of her books that there was Gnosticism is proof to her that there was a rivalry going on in the early church, and it's more reason to doubt, implying that it's more reason to doubt, the traditional understandings because of that. But what I find so interesting is that when you read her books, she read, if you were to ask her as a scholar, okay, so are you saying the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of not Barnabas, that's actually a Muslim document, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Truth, that's one that we know existed. Are you saying these carry equal historical weight as the New Testament for what we can know about the historical Jesus? Are you saying that they're actually equally true, maybe even more true, so that they were on to who the real Jesus was? And she would say, no. She admits actually all these documents were written later, and virtually none of them shed any light historically on the Jesus. And for the historical Jesus, yeah, most of the primary, most reliable sources we have to date is still within the New Testament. Like she says that. Bart Ehrman says that too in many of his books as well. Like he does not actually take as a historian anything else other than the New Testament seriously for Jesus. Because again, there is far more attestation for the New Testament and for its earliness and for its preservation and popularity too, for that reason, than anything else that we have, like period, anything else. The Gnostic Gospels and that whole thing are actually more evidence for that, because we know they were written later, and we know also for that reason and for the parallels they have that they were aware of and used the New Testament sources. The New Testament writings became part of their own sources that they used to form their own beliefs. So that, if anything, they're further evidence of the New Testament's priority among most people. Most professing Christians followed many of these same documents. And especially when it came to the four Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters, which is already most of the New Testament, that's pretty much attested in all of our earliest sources possible, even going back to the early 2nd century, and even in the 1st century within the New Testament itself, when Paul literally quotes the Gospel of Luke as scripture in one of his letters. So that's another argument for another time, of course. I just want to end with the whole point being that yes, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the best attested ancient facts we actually know about. And when we get into Easter, I will do a video on the resurrection next for Easter. The crucifixion is even more evidence in favor of the resurrection, because it is tied to it. Because in every source about Jesus's crucifixion, it's the resurrection is tied to it. It's a necessary doctrine for the crucifixion too. It is the reason Christianity did not die in the beginning, because all the early followers not only believed that Jesus was crucified, but that he rose from the dead. That's why the crucifixion had meaning suddenly, and wasn't the death knell of this new religion, of some religion claiming some ridiculous thing for that time. Like, you're saying the Messiah came not to do anything physical pretty much in any way on the earth, to rid us of our oppressors. He dies, the Romans are still in control for centuries after this. You're saying that he was crucified too, by the very oppressors and the very people he came to save. That's, as I said in my last video, you can't make this stuff up. You really can't. And I'll end on a final thing. Another thing about the crucifixion is that also in all four Gospels, again, what we learn constantly in connection with it is that Jesus very much was aware that it was going to happen, very much encouraging encouraging it to happen, because he claimed this is why he was actually here, was to be crucified for people's sins. That was a necessary part of it. So when you know the crucifixion really did happen, it has to make you then also question and realize, some of those things that were connected to the crucifixion and all of the sources about it suddenly hold a lot more historical value, I'd say. And for Jesus to predict this, you could say it was like, that doesn't necessarily prove he was who he was, that the fact that he was obviously trying to make it happen means that some natural person in his shoes that isn't God or anything special could imagine, something like that happening. You watch the Chosen series, obviously a lot of the people around Jesus are indeed worried it's going to happen. But here's the difference. Because then you have to take Jesus's teachings into account. We can get into different historical arguments on some of these claims, but I just want to talk about it because obviously they're connected to the crucifixion itself. I'm going to C.S. Lewis's famous argument that I think it still holds true today, where if you believe that Jesus actually said those things about himself, said these things, then you're left with only three options, only three logical options. Either Jesus is a lunatic, he's a madman, he has schizophrenia, he's got something crazy going on. Or he's a liar, he knows what he's doing, but he's lying deliberately. And both of those, we can just tell, are just totally not. I mean, lying is just debunked by the fact that that the whole point is to be crucified, and then he goes and crucifies himself. He clearly believed it. It's really hard to say that a liar would do something like that. So you're only left with he was a lunatic. But the issue with that is, like, when you read all his words and you read how he was remembered, like, no, a lunatic doesn't sound like, we just know intuitively. I would say it's a self-evident truth when you're reading through it for yourself that, yeah, this isn't a lunatic. Also, if you want to go historically, like logically, it would make very little sense for a lunatic to inspire this kind of following. I know I can already hear skeptics saying, "Oh, well, that's because they love saying that people like that were morons or whatever." But I'm like, Christianity, even in its earliest time, we have evidence spread to even the smartest people in its time, the richest people. Like, everyone from every walks of society was getting involved in this thing from the beginning, when the knowledge of Jesus was at its highest. And you're saying a lunatic, an actual lunatic crazed guy, did that. They may not have known what he was suffering from, but the ancient people were still very much aware of crazies in their time. When you read their works, they did know about crazy people. But that's a historical argument. I'm also just saying, if you take any knowledge of the teaching of Jesus as fact, which is very hard not to do when you consider all the sources we have, then it becomes very hard to say he's a lunatic. And so obviously the next only solution then is he was who he said he was. That's C.S. Lewis's point. That's what you're logically left with at the end of the day. Anyway, so that's the crucifixion. I'll go into the resurrection Sunday. I'll try to keep it under 30 minutes too, but we'll see. The resurrection is, God, obviously it's the quintessential doctrine of Christianity. You know, in my last video, I was pointing out how, you know, I don't consider myself part of any denomination. Not all doctrines are necessary for salvation, although all of them are still worthy to debate and are interesting. And as I said, doctrine is really, I hate that word in a sense because it has religious overtones, but yet it's so clearly what we do in all walks of life, though. We have doctrines and dogmas. Like, it's definitely not a religious thing only or a political thing only. It's just part of our life. But my point is that not all doctrines, right, are necessarily the most important, and all of us are ignorant, limited creatures, and we're all going to have flawed beliefs in some way. But when it comes to the resurrection and the crucifixion that we just talked about, those are just facts of life. To me, as factual as the sun existing, as anything else, and they are necessary beliefs for life in the future. And if you don't believe it, then I say this out of love again. It's just what I genuinely believe. And if for that reason, that's why I'm always, you know, energetic and wanting to share this with people, because I want them to know the real truth and be saved as well. So it's like a family, really. It's a family that is always welcoming new adopted sons and daughters, basically. That's actually what Christianity is Jesus came to start a family of orphans. We're all orphans that he adopted. And then the invitation is open to everyone. That doesn't mean you can believe anything you want. You still have, and you can't do anything you want either. You can't believe and you can't do anything you want. That's not love. But the invitation is open to you. It's open to everyone. That's true to me, by the way. I'm definitely not a perfect person. And I've questioned my faith many times in life too. Even recently, by the way. But yeah. All right, getting close to 30 minutes. Let me stop there and we'll get into the resurrection. Sunday, obviously.